May 25th, 2023, Nonprofit Executive Leadership Roundtable. I usually talk at this point and say how Christine and I are so fortunate to have been doing these roundtables for a number of years. In fact, they've not always been virtual. They were originally in person, and over the last 3 years have certainly become virtual, which is great because we've been able to bring people from around the country to get together and have these meetings with us and bring resources and bring knowledge and bring these important conversations that come out of when you put a room full of really smart, knowledgeable folks together. This is what happens. I'm Tommy D. I call myself the Nonprofit Sector Connector. I'm one of the partners of Vanguard Benefits, which is an employee benefits agency dedicated to the nonprofit sector. And I'm also the host of a weekly radio program, which is called Philanthropy in Focus. And I highlight the great work nonprofits are doing on that show every week. So without further ado, Christine, introduce yourself real quick for the video, just you and your company, and then we'll get started.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Christine Deska, the president and co-founder of Nonprofit Sector Strategies and Bell's Board. Really excited to be here today. We have a pertinent topic coming up, and I'll turn it right back over to Tommy to introduce our subject matter expert, Jane Halford.
Thank you, Christine. So in life, in connecting, in networking, it's all about relationships and the way it's just funny how things happen. So Jane and I have an existing connection relationship, and we're members of a national networking group that I'm the director of. It's called TNG, the networking group. And when someone has an event coming up, they'll put the information out there through the networking group, and it goes to the channels and it goes to people who have attended in the past, and it certainly goes to our membership. So my buddy, Christine Deska, sends me a note and goes, "Do you know this woman, Jane Halford, that TNG is promoting her event?" I said, "Of course I do." And then she goes, "I'd like to meet her because this event is very interesting to what we do, et cetera, et cetera." They have a meeting. Christine went to that event or got the recording and saw that. They connect. And then Christine goes, "Jane's going to be one of our speakers." And I go, "Well, isn't that the circle of life? We had to skip around Tommy D to get to Jane to come back this way." So I think that's all funny, but that's the whole thing. When I talk about Jane, I think in terms of picture an organization, picture all that knowledge that leadership has. What happens if there's a tragedy and that leader is no longer there instantly, some sort of disaster, and where does all that knowledge go? Okay, that's one version. Another version is we're more prepared. We get all of that intellectual property, that knowledge, just the stuff, the processes and procedures that were in some people's minds and maybe were never documented anywhere. We get that, and then we bring that forward to the new leadership team. So I know Jane's going to describe what she does kind of in more depth, but I'm going to read this. She's driven to help organizations and leaders achieve their goals by leveraging her experience as a CEO, a board member, an entrepreneur, and a CPA. She brings a breadth of experience to individuals and teams she works with. Through her business, Halford Consulting, Jane serves organizations through a range of services focused on leadership and governance transition through in-person and virtual training, advisory services, and professional speaking. She's currently the chair of the Canadian Crown Corporation and an agricultural technology startup company, and has past board roles include organizations in the nonprofit, public, and stock exchange listed entity sectors. Jane Halford, I'm sure you want to share some more about what you do, but I know you also have a presentation for us. Good morning. How are you? Welcome.
That's great. And thank you so much, Tommy and Christine, for making this happen. And I have to say, the pandemic was hard on everybody, but one of the gifts I take away from the pandemic is the ability to network without borders anymore, without any boundaries. So meeting Tommy was certainly a highlight in those dark times of March, April 2020. So I just really appreciate it. So Jane Halford, I'm actually living in Western Canada, and I have family in New York City. So we're heading down to New York here in another month. So that's going to be exciting to be back with my New York side of the family. So for today, our topic is your organization ready for your departure? And thank you all for introducing yourselves. And so I'm going to use your departure, but it might be somebody else in your organization. It might be a board that you're on. It really doesn't matter who it is, but I think the idea is that let's leave this morning different than we arrived. And so I'm going to share some hopefully practical things. And I believe, Tommy, I think I sent you the slides and you can send them out to everybody. There's a few QR codes along the journey. So if you wanted some quick access, you're welcome to do that, because my goal here is just to help you help your organizations and and share it with as many people as you think need the message. So let's dive in. So I'm going to start with a story. This story goes back about 15 years now. And I was sitting in a board meeting, and it was before we had everything on computers, looking down at my papers. And then somebody said, "Are you okay?" And I thought, what was that? And I look up and I catch my fellow board member's eye across the table, just as he said, "Are you okay?" And I started to look to my left, now realizing that he's talking to our CEO, who's 2 seats over from me, who's now slumped over in his chair. So right beside me is our board chair, who now became the first responder. And he started to push the CEO in his chair into the alcove just off the boardroom. And as he did that, he turned back to the corporate secretary and said, "Call 911. So I'm one of a handful of board members sitting at that table, just in stunned silence. We're so thankful the paramedics arrived quickly. We couldn't hear the conversation, but you could feel the energy in the room and the pace that they were working. And they had him probably in the ambulance en route to hospital within 10 minutes. And I will never forget the composure of our board chair as he walked back into the boardroom and says, "Folks, we've got about 5 minutes to have this meeting because we got to deal with staff and family." And he turned back to the corporate secretary and said, "What motions do we have to pass to appoint an acting CEO?" We passed those motions, and he said, "For those of you who aren't from the city," and I was one of those, "I suggest you head back to the airport and I'll keep you updated." And sadly, by the time I landed back home, our CEO had passed away of a stroke. And so I don't tell you that for the drama of it. I tell you that because I'm one person in one board meeting one day, and suddenly now I have this terrible situation on our hands. And I have to say that it took me about 5 or 7 years before I even really thought about that situation again. And maybe that's how people process. But once I realized I wanted to explore that more, I asked myself, why am I going to bring this back up? And I realized that it was probably a lot of shame, quite honestly, because it's what I didn't do in those scenarios that I thought, okay, I can make all kinds of excuses. I wasn't from that city. I was the most junior board member, blah, blah, blah. The reality is I had no idea how to help. And so that's why I'm really passionate about these topics, because even by being here today, hopefully you're not in a sad situation like that, but we need everybody here in our community to bring that light into that darkness. So whether it's a sad situation like this, or even a happy retirement of somebody we care for, somebody we've admired, the people around that leader still need somebody to say, "Okay, this is big news. We got this. Let me put forward one idea to get us moving." And that's what today is about. So I have a few slides. We'll definitely have some time for Q&A. And I just wanted to share with them some things that really just hopefully you can take forward into the world and help people navigate this tricky time of change. So I'm curious, I know we did a few introductions, but I'm curious to know if you want to put in the chat, what's your role in the organization? And for some of you, you're also board members on not-for-profits, but what's your role? And how long has your CEO or executive director or whatever title, the head of that not-for-profit, how many years have they been in the role? And if that's you, that's great. If it's not you, that's great. So let's take a look at the chat and see what the reality is of our organizations. All right. Got 5 years in there. Ah, 30 years. Well, while you guys are answering that, I do want to share with you, I was just looking at something the other day. So before the pandemic, the average tenure of a CEO in the US was about 7 years. That aggregates a whole bunch of data, but I would say that most board members, most not-for-profits thought, well, if our CEO has been around for 5 years or less, we don't have to worry about them leaving. And so, you get busy in life, you get busy in your work, and you don't think about it. for those of you who are seeing in the chat that, 10 plus years, 20 plus years founders, that's very interesting because that person is so core to the organization. And as Tommy said in his opening, what if they decide to retire? What if they don't come back tomorrow? And why would we want them to leave with all that knowledge? And so how do we pay it forward? One of the things that I like to flag for organizations is that even in today's world, I'm talking to leaders that have come in to lead not-for-profits within the time span of the pandemic, so 3 years or less. Those CEOs and EDs are saying to me, I'm not sure I'm the leader for the next 5 years. And I don't think any of those boards are thinking that their CEOs are thinking about leaving. And so when I ask the question, why are you thinking about leaving so early? Two things come up. One, I think you can probably predict, which is they're burnt out. Everybody had a rough go and you're trying to keep the lights on and serve the community, whatever your mission is as an organization, and they don't know how to refresh from here. So some of them say, well, maybe I'll step away and then come back into a different leadership role. The other thing that I find very fascinating, a lot of them are saying, I came in and I had to be a crisis time leader, and I don't know this organization when we're not in crisis. And so maybe my gift to this organization was crisis, and maybe we need somebody else to come in and follow into maybe a more predictable time. So really just saying, take back to your organizations. If we don't have a plan, first of all, for an emergency, let's get one. And if we're not talking about how we would get the knowledge from our leaders into the hands of other people, other leaders, get it written down, then let's start to work on that. Certainly a lot easier to work on it when we're not in the middle of a crisis. All right, let's just jump ahead here. So this is a much younger version of me. I would like to say that, when you come into a leadership role, you receive a gift of transition. And then when you leave your role, you give a gift of transition. So both of these experiences were probably more typical, but at the same time, what was my arrival experience? Well, I followed a CEO who had been gone already for 6 months. And so when I asked the board, what would you expect from me in my first 90 days, 100 days? I don't think they actually remember they said this, but I know they said this. Do whatever your predecessor would have done. Okay, super helpful. This is my first CEO gig. I really liked the person who ran the organization before me, but I was 2 levels below him, so I didn't actually know what his job was. So that was not particularly helpful. And everything revolved in our organization around that CEO. He had been there for 25 years. So whoever he was as a human, everything hung off of his style. So I ended up having to basically restructure the entire organization, which was humbling. And you want to make sure that you approach those with great caution. But what's the flip side for me? The flip side of me was 7 years later, I gave my board 90 days written notice that I was leaving. And for a lot of strange and dramatic reasons, the board chose not to tell anybody I was leaving. And on the 80th day, so 10 days before my departure, I called the chair of the HR committee and I said, well, nobody's talked to me about my departure, but I wanted to let you know I'm giving back my computer. How are they going to disable my IT access? And I said, and you've never mentioned to me who's going to lead this not-for-profit afterwards. And the reaction was also stunning. Well, we thought you might stay. Well, what part of the last 80 days was me staying? So I ended up agreeing to stay for an extra 10 days, but that's it. So they literally walked down the hall and picked somebody, and that person is still their CEO after 10 years. Now, she was amazing, but I didn't have the opportunity to hand over to her because she had a full-time job in her current job. And, by 10 calendar days in, you really don't have a lot of time. So I would say that give a better gift than you might have received would be the bottom line there. And that goes for any role in the organization, because you have specialized knowledge, and sometimes high-performing leaders of any kind, they kind of fail to recognize that they've got the secret sauce. So we want to make sure the secret sauce gets shared. So you might have seen this in the promo material for today, but this is what I call the 15-minute challenge. And why I put this as 15 minutes, because honestly, if you spend 15 minutes either by yourself, with the leadership team of your organization, even with the board, you will be in a far better position. But it's really my scenario. If you had 10 days to hand over your current role, what would you share? Who would you share it with? What would you write down? And if you give yourself 15 minutes, and this is great for Tommy, because Tommy, you can focus for 15 minutes, get it down, hand it over. And then someday, if you have more time and you can have an orderly transition, you can pick up from there and it's not so overwhelming. But Judy, I see your hand. I would love to take your question.
Thank you. I'm wondering, do you recommend you pick one or two people to share the information with in like that you want to share, or do you think about stepping back and sort of reassessing who could do the role and maybe share the information amongst a team so that if you leave, others can pick up and maybe be ready to reallocate work?
Yeah, I would say whatever fits your organization. Sometimes the leader can share with their whole leadership team or a whole bunch of people, and they get a better, deeper understanding about what the not-for-profit is doing, where did it come from? So spreading it widely is great. Sometimes it's only a handful of people, and sometimes, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that you don't really have a successor inside. So is it actually getting to write it down? And what I found, especially with leaders that are going to come into sort of the retirement phase of their life, even to get it recorded, whether it's a Zoom call like this where you set a recording, or whether somebody takes notes during a Q&A, sometimes just getting them talking as people and sharing their experience might be better. But boy, if you have time to actually write it down or pass it on to one person, that's an extra bonus for sure.
Can I ask one follow-up question?
Of course.
So my next question is like what in my house we would call the Derek Jeter problem. So, like Dee in some ways did not have a chance taking over from Derek Jeter because it was Derek, right? No one was going to fill the hearts and probably not have the same glove. So how do you prepare your organization and your board, especially if you've got a CEO or an ED who's been there since the beginning, is the founder, has even been there longitudinally, like 10, 15, 20 years. How do you suggest you work with that situation?
Oh my gosh, I got a tool for that. So if you want to give me a second, I'll go on to it.
Sorry.
No, it's great. It's great. I love the questions and please keep them rolling. But really, that's it. That's exactly the point, is that it's what you don't know is leaving the organization that, whether it's 6 months from now or 5 years from now, or we'll never know what we lost. And that's the important part about passing it forward. The other thing I like to do, and this is bad because I spend a lot of time as board members, so testing the board is something that usually brings home this point. So lots of you have boards or on boards. I would say the same kind of thing. If you can actually get a 15-minute agenda item, call it a learning session. If you have the luxury of not telling them what it is, that's fine. But what I've done to some boards, and obviously with some consent, is to say to them, so for this 15 minutes, we're going to pretend your CEO is never coming back. What is your board going to do today in this moment? If this was your reality, what are the top 3 things you're going to do today? And then usually they're like, oh my gosh. And I said, you have to pretend this is real, because if we think about getting through this 15-minute block, you can start to think about this differently. You're going to ask yourselves questions about your readiness differently. And then if you have more than 15 minutes, what would they do in the next 48 hours? And whether it's a weekend or a weekday, it might vary. And then what would you do in the first 7 to 14 days? So that 2-week run from the moment you learn to sort of catching your breath and actually taking some steps forward. You'll see this QR code. It actually takes you to just a blog that I wrote on this. So in case that's helpful, but I would say the surprising failure place for most boards, and maybe you won't be surprised, they don't have each other's phone numbers. They certainly don't have a phone number of a staff member that's not their ED or CEO, and they may not even have the ED or CEO's number. So by letting them, let's call it fail at that point, tells you, like, even if we could write this in a 1-page document, if this happens, pull this document, here's the names and numbers you have to call, And if there's a backup CEO or somebody who will take the reins for even this first 14-day period, that person's on the list, that person knows that they could ever get that call. So I would say encourage the board to embrace this uncertainty for 15 minutes. They will probably decide to prioritize this a bit differently. Because that's the hard part, is that you think about your CEOs or EDs, like they don't want to talk about it. It's like talking about death or taxes. Like nobody wants to talk about this stuff. So I think we have to put the emergency scenario on the table first. So people go, wait a minute, I don't want to leave that kind of legacy either. Tommy, I see your hand.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about the emotional part of this conversation. In this example, in this role play, the ED, the CEO is not in the room, right? You set this up, maybe either the board chair has set it up or you've come in and set it up. I just think this is more of a comment and maybe a bit of a question. It's like, I feel like these, especially in a situation where it is the founding ED and they've been in this role and this is their baby, the whole thing. Gosh, I don't even know if some organizations do any sort of regular review process on he or she who is at the head of the organization. So I wonder, can you talk about it from even starting this conversation, which can be a really uncomfortable conversation, especially now. Look, some organizations, I think the person is super thoughtful and realizes this, and other organizations it might be, dare I use the word, tyrannical or a dictator type ship. I'm thinking one organization I do not sit on the board of, but I have a friend on the board, and I'm aware of, like, it's it's almost like a cartel, like where like it's own, like that's, and it's always like the board is at odds. It's like sort of it's almost like the board works for the ED versus the ED working for the board, So maybe you could speak to a little bit of that challenge there.
Yeah, absolutely. And think about how many not-for-profit boards really don't know what the role of the ED is. Like they interact with them at meetings or they interact with them in some place in the community, but they have like 10% knowledge what that whole role is. Many of you have lived that. So you think, oh my goodness, like if they don't even know, how are they supposed to hire the person who comes behind? And so one of the things that I like to encourage people to think about is, what is the picture of your current CEO, ED, founder, and what makes them special and unique? And if we can actually capture the current picture, we're in a better starting place to say, okay, what makes this person successful in this role? And of course, with a founder, like think about the network, think about the history. There's a whole bunch to pass forward there. But I think, Tommy, you also hinted at the fact that one of the things that really challenges people when you're the founder, your identity is part of that. So going and saying, I'm going to leave this, I'm going to step away. And I think Vicki had mentioned that as well with when she founded the not-for-profit. It's like, how do you hand this to somebody else? And what conditions would have to be there for you to feel great about that? And I think that we need to start talking about it early. And what is that picture of the leader of the future? But start from the leader of today. If they're there, they're doing amazing work. Let's start from that picture. Then we can start to adapt it. Amy, I see your hand. Oh, you're muted still.
There we go. So for the most part, when we do this kind of session, which I think is really important, and our board has talked a lot about succession planning, and each of our board meetings, our executive director is present. How do you bring this up without it being a threat to the executive director, where she doesn't feel like she's being pushed out? And I would think you would want to have her included, or the person included in the conversation, or do you do it where the person isn't included in the conversation so that threat is not there?
Yeah, I think if we're going to start from a place of emergency planning, and I can see in the chat, you have various degrees of readiness for that. If you're really starting with a basic plan or plan we haven't looked at for a while, I think start with the person in the room and say, hey, we still have this human sitting here. So let's actually have the conversation, because this might be the time where we can document what they know. And so that if we find ourselves in that situation, and once that emergency plan is set, then you can start to say, well, let's think about succession, and we can talk about that in a minute for sure. But let me just show you a quick tool, and it really is goes to your question, Amy, yours, Tommy, and as well Judy's. And really, I did not create this, but a gentleman by the name of David Herdling created this model, and you may have seen it, you may not have, but it's the cash box. And what I like about this is if you get the board, you get the current CEO, ED, founder, whoever is, anybody who's knowledgeable about the role that is the head of the organization. So what is your current CEO's cash box? So what knowledge and skills do they bring to this role? So if it wasn't this human, what's leaving the room? And as we think about knowledge and skills, I would say that what must a CEO in this organization know or have skills to do? And what is nice for them to have? So the must-haves probably are a pretty short list. A nice to have list is huge, right? But by basing it based on your current person or the current founder, that's helpful. What is really stunning is the attitudes and habits side of this, which boards and organizations don't often talk about. What is that attitudes and habits that actually equip this CEO, this ED, this founder to be successful? And why do those matter? So for some of you, it could be that you have to work so collaboratively with your external stakeholders that if somebody doesn't come with that attitude of inclusion, seek first to understand, being proactive, being transparent, being welcoming. I mean, some of you serve populations that really we just need that open arms feeling, but we need to put some language to that. So if you fill in the cash box for your current leader, now we can start to say, in an emergency, what would we have to have? And so an emergency person might take the helm for 3 months or 6 months. And so you wouldn't still have that extensive list, but you would have, we need some basics, some basic government relations, some basic financials, some basic sort of operational know-how, depending on the size of your organization. And I know you range from a handful of staff members to 100 staff members. It's very different. So I think if you got through those first two hurdles, that feels very different. And then when you face like a retirement, or when you actually are going to exit somebody, now you can start to work with the outgoing leader, the board, external stakeholders to say, what is the cash box for the next leader? Because the next leader may look different from our current one, but we've already done the homework on the current and of the emergency. So now we can pick up and go the next step. So I don't know if that kind of starts to play out a little bit of an answer to your question. Judy, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm wondering, does this, or to address Amy's point, maybe, could this be worked into the concept that we preach all the time? You need really good job descriptions of your staff. And so if you can maybe frame it that way with your current executive director, hey, we need to really understand what your role is. We're trying to develop these job descriptions. We want to make sure it's accurate. So it can be done, I think, in a non-threatening way. And like, hey, look, we're trying to fulfill our duties and make sure we can help you, but we need to understand what that is. Let's talk about what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you want to get as proactive, and I saw in the chat that you have like the detailed disaster plan, you're right. What's the current job description? You think about your organizations that haven't had a new CEO ED hire in more than 5 years. That job description may not exist at all, especially if it's a founder, or it might be from 1985. Like how terrible would that be if you're sitting there thinking, well, what does this person do? Oh, this is dated 1997. I wonder if this is anywhere close to what they do. And it isn't. So you can change that. I think that's a great suggestion, Judy. Christine, I see your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo Judy's comment and thank Amy for the question, because I think it like with many things we discuss in these environments, it's so much about framing and going to the table, really starting from a place of how much you value the current leader and their attributes and what they bring to the table is a way to kind of start the conversation in a very positive manner, but also preparing for the worst. And if you're starting from that point, then hopefully the sitting leader is much less likely to feel like there's any pressure to push out the door, but it's more we're working together to build a more sustainable organization. So I love all of these conversation starters. I love how it's 15 minutes. It's very digestible. It's a tangible way to kind of get the conversation going. I think this is really, really amazing, Jane.
No, thank you. Well, let me give you another, I'm going to call it an analogy, because this might help as well, is that if you can get through the conversation about planning for the emergency, now it's like how are we going to move this to the conversation around getting ready for a happy, orderly transition of that leadership role, even if we don't know the timing. And so sometimes we get caught up in what's succession planning and what's transition is successful, practical in a not-for-profit or in an organization our size. So I like to think about this whole story as being sort of the change in command at the International Space Station. So if you think about NASA or SpaceX training thousands of astronauts, these are people who want one day to have the skill set to even be selected for a space mission. And ultimately, some of them will aspire to actually be the next commander of the International Space Station. So we're in the people development business. It doesn't matter what the formal role of that organization is. If we come to the table with the mindset, we want to grow the humans that are here to their best capacity. Someday, if we need a new senior person, a new ED, then we will have the best possible selection of inside. In a small organization, you may not get that, but at the same time, if we're in the people development business, we're always growing talent. And I think that's an important piece. But at some point, when you know that handover is coming and that you actually have to go to hire, now you start to move into the transition. And it's like taking that large astronaut pool and saying, who's actually going to be put on the space vehicle and who's going to sit in that commander's seat. And that's your formal search and selection process. But then I like to think of that moment the board has made their choice on the next ED CEO and they announce it publicly. And I think about what it must feel like to sit on this rocket when those engines go off. That must be how it feels when you're publicly announced as the next leader of this organization. And the rumblings and the excitement and the terror and everything flying by. And all you got to believe is that all your training in your life to this point is going to help you lead this organization, this space station. So if we take the analogy further, the actual space vehicle docks at the space station. At that moment of docking, we haven't changed leaders. Your current commander, your current CEO is still fully there in command of the space station. And I can imagine up in space, they have such a formal change in command that we forget to do that at our organizations. We kind of like, hey, all right, Sally's the next CD. Yeah, welcome, Sally, let's go. And we have to think about what's the plan of handover? How is somebody, in fact, stepping down from command and somebody else stepping up? And that there's total clarity, in this case, on the space station, if not in your not-for-profit, who is the commander? When did that change happen? And there is only ever one leader. And I would say that I push this out one more step, which is now the former commander has to get in a space vehicle, come back home. And if that commander is actually going into career retirement, won't take another full-time job, I would say that it must feel like what astronauts feel when they come back to Earth and get out of the space vehicle. They're first exhausted because of the intensity of that leadership role, and they're squashed because of gravity. And if we think about the conversation we just had around founders and the identity being that and living and breathing that not-for-profit's mission, whether it was for 5 years or 50 years, now that person has to literally lift themselves up against that pull of gravity and redefine themselves. And so I flag that if your founder or your CEO is going into retirement, there is an entire other grief period that they're going through. And so you'll start to see that grief behavior coming out, even if they've chosen their retirement date. So I think it's just a really important part to just really flag that there's many steps along this journey, but if we can solve the emergency scenario, then we can start to say, are we developing our people right? And then at some point that leader is going to feel safe enough to say, hey, wait a minute, I got more to share. I need some runway for that. Or it may free them to say, hey, now that we're talking about this, maybe I can think differently. And I think founders in particular I'm going to say that it's burdened in the best way possible. Like, how are they going to hand this forward? And at some point it became so big and so much them, they can't see their way forward. And it takes great people that they trust around them to actually help them say, how do we actually get you to pay it forward? And let's get started there. So maybe, Judy, did you want to jump in there?
No,
You're square lit up. So I was all excited. I'm like, you're square lit up. Let's go.
I would say though, I mean, from like the lawyer perspective on this, I think it's really important that you draw clear lines to your point, like, okay, you've gotten on the spaceship, you're coming home. You need to be able to distinguish, and the board needs to know who they're talking to and who they're answering to.
Yeah.
And be clear about that in the nicest of ways, of course. But we see problems come up all the time because people want to be nice, and nice gets you into legal problems sometimes.
Absolutely. Tommy, you wanted to add to that?
I want to, add and also kind of bring it a little different direction. So it's interesting, what you just shared there. This person, I'm trying to say this delicately, this leader, this founding executive director may be searching for an exit, a way out that they can't see a way out because they are the thing. The thing was them, it's them doing a thing with no employees. And now they have 100 employees and stakeholders and 30 people on their board and all these things that they have. And now they don't know what to do, maybe like you said, you're giving them, as the board chair of the board together, the opportunity to go, this thing can exist without you. We just need to find a way, like maybe at 50, it's no big deal, but it's 70 and you're still at the helm and you're like, how can this thing go on without me? So they need that runway. I think that's really, really critical. My other part of it is how all that goodwill that founding ED has from the time he or she was 25 years old and they started this idea to now they're 65 years old or 60 years old. That what comes up for me, and I think it's because we all look at the world through a certain lens, and my lens is the network, their connections, their relationships, right? I know I've joined as a volunteer with organizations because I love the leader and I like the mission, right? Which is, I think, generally while the leader is in that seat is something that needs to be discussed, because that goodwill, if that leader goes, you're going to lose some folks. So I wonder if you could speak to that as far as generally a transition of the goodwill, the relationships, the connections while they're in the seat, meaning if they might not be going anywhere for 5 years. How do we still make sure that people are bought in? And maybe Christine jumps in on this too, because from a board perspective, how do we make sure the board is bought in for the mission, that we feed people versus that we love the person who's at that top seat,
Absolutely. I put in the chat, and then I'll go to Judy, an article. It's like literally a 1-page article about, you were a founder, now what are you? And what I love about this article is it gives a whole bunch of ideas on what founders could be after they're not the CEO anymore. In some ways, I think most organizations won't see that founder disappear. Their name might be on the not-for-profit. They're highly integrated in the network. They live in the community. They're passionate about the topic. And so they're not going to leave. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be abundantly clear what their new role is. And that's where the next CEO, the next ED also needs that clarity, or else they're going to rule from afar. And we've seen too many failures when the CEO doesn't really leave and you can't get the next CEO. So they might as well have stayed, right? Yeah. So let's go to Judy.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm sitting here and I'm looking at Amy and I think, oh my God, she's our model, right? She left, but she hasn't really left and people still associate her. But on the other hand, there were transitions and people know. And I think when you do a really good job as a CEO or an ED or whatever we're calling you this week in the literature, it's you, but you're also building the brand, and the brand shouldn't be you. It should be the mission. And especially if you're going to be transitioning, you board know you're going to be transitioning your ED off. I understand, like, people get sick, there are emergencies, disasters, but to the extent you have any ability, we're always counseling. Let's building it out. Let's do what they do in England. Like, we knew that crown was passing. Like, there was no doubt it was going to be handed over at some time. And you see this buildup of leadership. And you also sometimes talk about how we're redistributing because it's going to make us stronger. But like, I look at Amy and like, I've used book fairies before as an example of super well done, because she's like the perfect example for me of how to make it happen.
Love it.
So Tim, I'm sorry, I see that your hand is up, but I do just want to jump in because I was asked to speak about founder syndrome, which is coming up in June for the Nonprofit Resource Hub, and I was very aware of founder syndrome. I did all my research before I handed over the organization. And now 4 years later, I'm going back just to do more research to see what founders, make sure I have all my talking points in order. And I've actually kind of been kicking myself for the past number of days saying, oh my Lord, like for those past 4 years, I have been deeply entrenched in founder syndrome, and I didn't even realize how bad it was. So thank you for seeing things as being very possible, but I feel like this is being tailored just to speak to me as to how to get out of an organization when the board doesn't want you out. And yet your role is so ambiguous that you end up creating more frustration and confusion than if things had been laid out properly right from the start. So I just think this session is amazing. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. Tim, let's hear from you.
Yeah, and I'm just kind of piggybacking off of the past couple comments from Amy and Tommy. And so I serve as I mentioned earlier, as COO, and our CEO is our founder and has been there 25 years, so it's a really unique position to be in. And I have a lot of respect for, what she's done and how the organization has grown over this time. I think that, from like an agency culture perspective, we're talking about this consistently, right? And I think in some ways that softens the blow to a certain extent, or it allows our CEO to think about it and how it relates to her too. When we're talking about, well, Tim, what are we thinking about for you? What are we thinking about for these managers? What are we thinking about for, when these people, do we have are we safeguarding ourselves, right? And it's purely mission driven, right? Like, so what's going to happen to the women and children that we serve if this person goes? And so rather, directing all of that energy towards her, and I understand that, she's the boss, right? Like, and it's especially unique when she's the founder, but by including conversations about other people and about the agency as a whole, I think that in some ways it makes it easier for her to think a little bit more about how, this impacts her and her role. And we're having a lot of conversations around that right now for her too. And it's very transparent and open. And I'm sure it's very difficult for her because she's been in it for a while and put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into the work. So, but I'm just kind of want to highlight the concept of, incorporating the many roles that are also significant within the organization, and how planning for those in some ways impacts or affects planning for the top position as well.
That's spot on. And I think the more we can, I'm going to say, normalize it or make it part of the typical conversation, whether it's in the organization or on the board, if we can actually say growing people at all levels is important here, so that we have that continuum of leadership. Not everybody's going to be the CEO, but we still need people growing. What are the board's jobs? Like, they have to oversee that, but they should be having an annual discussion with the CEO, for the key roles, like who's ready to take over if we had an unexpected or a retirement or somebody left. Who's going to be ready? What are you, CEO, doing to help grow those humans in the organization? And where will we have holes? Like, lots of organizations will not be able to grow up from within. You're too small, or that's just not the development path to some of those senior roles. So let's all know that we don't have successors, and we would go to market. And if there was an emergency, this is how we'd cover it. And the CEO and other leaders in the organization, it's exactly to Tim's point. What are we doing to grow the talent of the organization? Are we in fact taking the time to give performance feedback, create development plans, mentor it? And I think the other piece there, are we bringing potential successors, whether they're the CEO, ED successor, or other leadership, are we putting them in positions to meet with the board? And that's terrifying if that's not your role. But if that's where we see somebody's potential, get them to do those presentations, get them out in front, get them into scenarios. For example, some of your folks would be great, but they don't have that public image side. So can we give them speaking opportunities? Terrify them? Sure. They might not do great. Okay, well, let's just keep pushing forward and make sure that we're growing them. And I think that does, as Tim said, it takes the pressure off on focusing just on the leader But I think if the CEO or the founder gets involved in realizing that we're developing the whole team, then it becomes a lot safer to say, and what about your role, right? So let me just hit on one more thing, and then let's just have a quick Q&A. So lots of organizations, not-for-profits included, actually get successful and they actually grow their next ED. So what happens when you get there? Does the board actually go down the hall, as it did in my case, and appoint the next leader? Or do you have to go to an external search? Why or why not? And what was really interesting, I chaired a not-for-profit where this happened exactly. The CEO had been there 25 years. She was super beloved. She had found like the person that she believed would be the next CEO, trained him up. We all knew him. He was great. He was super confident. And then as we announced her retirement, there was an odd buzz in our community. And I don't know if this happens in your community, where people were saying, well, it's time for a change in this organization. Like 25-year leader, we liked her, but we got to do something different. So her successor that everybody knew she had chosen is going to be more of the same. So now we've got a problem, is we've got donors and funders and strategic partners already judging this person, and we haven't even opened the job. So now we had to have a hard conversation at the board saying, are we searching? Are we appointing? We believe that he fit our cash box. I should say that very clearly. We ended up deciding we had to search to actually engage the community and those stakeholders in the fact that we are putting it out there to the world. This is the picture we're looking for. And in our community, it gets kind of gossipy. So as much as you protect the confidentiality of candidates, it doesn't stop those candidates from telling other people they're competing. So it got out there who some of the candidates were. And in the end, we did appoint him. Now, what happened right away was that boomerang to the good, which was, well, if he competed against those kind of people, he must be awesome. And suddenly the community was won over on him, but it was super high risk because we took somebody who was talented and we went to search, which meant he was going to leave probably if he wasn't appointed. And quite honestly, the peace of mind I got on that was he's ready to be a CEO. And so if it's not here, it will be somewhere, and the world will be better off for him leading somewhere, but terribly high risk. And it paid off, but it wouldn't always. Judy, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to say in New York State, you probably have to do that search.
Yes.
You probably have to throw it out. I mean, I see the Attorney General's Charities Bureau freaking, especially if it's a larger organization, because I don't know how you would prove that you were fulfilling your fiduciary duty of care otherwise. So that for
Absolutely.
me, if you call me, that's just an easy one.
Yeah, and that's a great comment. Like if you have to, you have to, and then it's nice and easy. But if you don't have to, then do you, right?
So here's your other problem, which we're starting to see bubble up. And I'm sorry if I'm monopolizing this conversation, but like these phone calls come in all the time. We have these conversations every day here. Here's the other problem: pay transparency. Westchester, it's already live. It's been live for months now. So now you start bumping into problems. You're not, especially now, are you going to be able to get somebody at the price you've been paying your old CEO? Probably not, to be honest. And then you start seeing people start looking, and you're going to bump into, is our wage band okay? Like, is our salary band okay? What's going on with comp? And you start to see this compression or not, and that sets off all kinds of other problems. Not really sure how you solve that problem, but I know it's becoming a problem, at least here in Westchester, and it's going to be a problem in New York State. I think it's come September.
Absolutely. That's 100%. It's suddenly the Band-Aid gets ripped off and you start to see other things that need caring, and they all need caring for now because we're changing the leader. Amy, jump on in.
Taking off mute. So what do you do if you have a small organization, 5 people, but only 2 are full-time, and you're not going to be hiring from within? Your board is not going to take over that emergency ED position, and you need to put somebody in there to just stabilize the organization. Where do you go? How do you find that person, even if it's just that temporary?
Yeah, I had an organization that I did this, and I was so proud of them because they were truly, well, at the time, they were 5 people, including the ED. And you're right, they weren't all full time. And so what they did was they actually put down like the critical functions that the ED has sign off on or makes decisions on. That was everything from payroll to computer logins to banking, you name it. And he was the only one who had authority to do that. So what happened was they said, if it was an emergency, this board member or the board chair or whoever would take over those functions at least for a week or two or whatever. And then what they also had was a list of people that they would call to see if they could find a temporary person. So it was everywhere from like an executive search firm that would do an interim leadership to people in the community that they knew were former EDs of organizations that might be willing to, maybe they're retired, but they'd be willing to take on a 6 months leadership. And then, they ask themselves the question once a year, would anybody here on the board be willing and available if it happens this year? And lots of times the answer to that is no. So now it's like, what's the phone call list that we're going to have? And in the meantime, how do we make sure people get paid at the next payroll, right? So it's that balance between really practical and actually saying, it's probably not us for a period of time. Because, I bet right now, it probably takes 3 months to 6 months to recruit somebody. So you really aren't talking a matter of weeks. And it's so rare that you have the totally perfect person ready to go in that moment that it's important. Go ahead, Tommy.
I know, great questioning. I know there's these interim ED CEO types out there. Maybe they're retired, or maybe this is just they resigned from a position and then now they're doing this interim position. There's companies out there. My thoughts are, even that though, in the moment of disaster strikes, if you don't already have the number and you haven't spoken to these people, it's too late probably. So
Yeah,
I wonder if there's this, maybe I'm making this up and creating it right now, but a service where these interim folks who run a company of interim EDs, interim CEOs, can be super proactive. And almost, I don't know if the right word is retainer, if you got to pay them ahead of time, but just where they have some knowledge of a backup, like a backup system in place, right? Like, what do they call when IT with redundancy? If it doesn't,
yeah, that's right.
Here, it's there, it's in Omaha, we store it in this cloud over here, all that sort of stuff. Like, what if all that knowledge was somehow you had a backup? I know there's one particular organization on Long Island that operates, and I'm sure there's more, but almost like both men who run this organization are called CEO and president. Because I looked at the website, I know they co-run this organization together, but I looked at their titles and it says like president, CEO, and the other one says CEO, president sort of deal, but they have different roles. But again, it also creates that backup, so I wonder, Jane, have you seen that or should we create that, a company that does just that and brings that sort of backup there just in case?
Yeah, and if I see Judy put something in the chat that you may have organizations that do that. I know in my home community, we do have one that's like the volunteer, it's like the Association for Not-for-Profits, right? And so there may be that formal structure. However, I'll share with you one story that it wasn't a not-for-profit, it was a small business owner. And I had done a session similar to this. And he came up to me at the end and he said, I'm taking an important message away today. And I said, what's that? And he said, well, I realized that if I died, my wife would have to run the business or make these business decisions. That's how I left the company. My wife doesn't even know where the office is. And I'm not going to do that to her. So my commitment to you, Jane, is that I'm going to make some phone calls tonight to people in my business network that says, if I died unexpectedly, phone my wife and say, I had this conversation with your husband. Him and our friends are going to try to figure this out for you. We've got your back. And I think about the power of this group here today and all the people, in an emergency, do you want to have that conversation that says, hey, if Tim doesn't come back tomorrow and his founder goes with him, is somebody going to call Tim's organization and say, hey, I know Tim and I'm sorry we're going through this, but is there anything that we in the network of not-for-profits can do to help you? Think of the power of that, right?
Incredible.
So I probably have said lots. I said to Tommy, I had a whole section on actually the handover, the transition of CEOs, and we probably don't have time for that today, but I'm happy to take questions for as long as you want. And I'm just such a super nerd at this. And now because of my opening story, you understand why that is. So feel free to email me. I've just dropped my email there, and happy to share resources or to have a conversation. Or if you want me to beam into your board meetings or whatever and scare your board for like 15 minutes and throw that scenario out, happy to do that. It's just, I just know how important it is. So let me leave it at that and go to questions or anything else Christine and Tommy want to do to close.
Just come off mute. We're going to stop at 9:55. I always make that promise. Christina, I made that promise last year, I guess, that we'd get you to your 10 o'clock. That was when you just had to go to the next Zoom room. Maybe we got to reconsider, because I'm getting in a car after this. Any quick questions, just come off mute. And then Jane, that other piece you just talked about, you know what, don't threaten us with a good time. You'll just have to come back and talk about that, what a transition actually looks like. That's a whole session right there. So anybody just come off mute if you have a question or comment for Jane Halford.
Well, I'll chime in while we see if there's a question, just to thank Jane again, because this is so pertinent for me. I'm actually facilitating a session in a one-off fashion with a nonprofit soon, where they're deciding whether they're going to merge with another organization, or they're deciding whether they're going to continue independently. And if they continue independently, the leader has to transition out. The leader has already committed to transitioning out in 3 years. And so it's a very much combined conversation related to a lot of these topics. And so I personally found this helpful as I'm thinking of the context to help this board and leader discuss this and try to decide their path forward. It's all tied together. This is just such good information, Jane.
Oh, thank you. And I think, even if they wanted to play out the scenario of merging, like even taking that cash box, it says, so you've got 2 CEOs right now. When we merge the organization will be different. So what's the cash box for the new CEO? Because it may not be either of the 2 current. And that's a tough conversation, is that the organization may be fundamentally different. And if it is one of the 2, then let's be clear what the picture is without attaching somebody's name or biography to it. And then let's go in with full confidence, because otherwise we're just kind of having a bit of a gamble that like CEO number 2 is the right one. Okay, let's move forward. Well, CEO 2 also is not going to be perfect. Like obviously a merged organization is going to be a scale up of something, size, complexity, different service lines. And so that person's going to have to grow as if they were new to the organization anyways.
Yes. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Jane, in terms of trying to avoid founder syndrome, what do you recommend are safeguards that you can put in place? Because I think it's two-sided. I think it's the founder needs to be aware of founder syndrome, and then the person coming in also needs to not be stereotyped, assuming that whatever the founder does is based upon founder syndrome. So what structures have you seen that works to help that out?
Yeah. I don't think this is right in all situations, but the concept's okay. Like, what's the actual new job description of the now former founder? So it's like in your case, it's like, if you're going to stay connected, what does that look like? And if you were going to write it in a job description, that's not the right tool, but it would look like this. It would interact with the organization this way. That might be interaction with the new ED. It might be interaction with donors or funders, people, advocates in the community, but trying to get clear what it is and what it isn't. And then having that conversation, probably both with the new ED and you can find like the complementary skills. Like for a while, you might be the right person to connect with certain network, but your goal together with that new ED is within a year or 2 that you could leave that relationship and the relationship would be fine. So it's an exit plan. And then with the board, it's like, when do they want to talk to the founder and why do they want to talk to the founder? And if it's just because we like you and we know, well, then it's like, no, you talk to the ED, and if they need help, I'm there to help them and trying to exit that. But it is tricky because you're part of the fabric and you can't unweave it without weaving the blanket, right? And so I think really being purposeful and connect where with intention and then disconnect with intention and then trying to protect those boundaries. But that's easier said than done, Amy, for sure.
The only other thing is that I've been reading articles and half of them have said, well, a lot of them have said, do not join the board if you are the ED transitioning out, don't join the board. And then I thought you were supposed to leave for about a period of a year, so that way the ED could get their feet on the ground, but you have too much historical data that to step out, it's too difficult.
Yeah, you almost take a mentor role. I would say that, yeah, I think it's pretty rare that somebody can go away for a year and then and not have lost the opportunity to share knowledge. But I agree with you. Moving onto the board, it seems like it's the obvious choice, but it takes a pretty exceptional person to be able to sit in a totally different role and not either be too hard on the new ED or actually become the de facto ED. So it's a very risky, I've seen it work a couple times, but it was the founder that says, I have fully switched and I can protect that boundary. And I don't think many people can. Tim, your hand is up.
Yeah, I was just going to say something real quick. I know it's so much more complicated than this, but I think this also calls to mind for me the necessity to leverage the tools that, like, we're right now diving deep into SharePoint, right? Making the plunge for our organization into, like, really making sure that that infrastructure is in place and that knowledge is accessible. I mean, obviously these people, there's so much more about an ED that, you know, goes into that role. I'm not trying to minimize it by any means, but we can all better serve ourselves by making sure that some of the day-to-day activity that is also involved in the job is accessible, is clear. You know, I mean, I think about that all the time from my role, just that policies and procedures and templates. And, you know, if I think Greg mentioned earlier, hit by a bus. I've kind of shifted that to abducted by aliens. I feel like it's a little bit more friendly, but, you know, I used to use that one all the time too. But, you know, if that happens, like, and someone has to pick up, or is it going to be, you know, am I setting them up well, is the question that I'm asking myself all the time. And there's so many tools that we can use to do that, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And the power of Zoom. Honestly, it's like you could actually just record yourself for like 15 minutes saying, hey, you know, when it comes to this time of year, it's like budget planning cycle. And so this is how I've approached the budget in the past. You might not choose to do this, but here's some factors, here's some tricky things, and just save the recording. Like, it maybe seems a little bit odd just to record yourself, but just do it. And, you know, because not everybody is going to actually take the time to write it down. So maybe film is easier. All right, we're at 7:54.
I think that brings us to the culmination of this meeting. Jane Halford, I mean, timing is everything in life. And if it wasn't for you to have this recent event and Christine read the email and then this doesn't happen. And I think people are blessed now just having seen this information here live, and certainly anybody who finds the recording can always get in touch with you. Why don't you just do a shout out to the website or wherever you want people to find you, since we're going to be putting this up on YouTube.
All right, it's Halford, HALFORD.co. There's no M at the end. And very excited that in a month from now, we're going to rebrand the website. But for now, you'll find lots of resources on there. And basically, Jane at Halford.co is my email, and follow across social media, probably in Jane Halford 7. But happy to take your questions by email, and don't hesitate. The work that nonprofit space does changes our world. So please keep up the good work, and I'm here to support you in that journey.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks everybody for being here. Make it a great day.
Thank you.